Colin Turner. I'm a surveyor. I've been trading and living in Dorchester for about 40 years. We originally acted for the Hobbs family when they owned Higher Burton Farm. That was acquired by the Barber family, who you may or may not be aware of, sort of fairly significant national cheese producer based in Ditchett and Lytton Cheney. So they're quite a significant employer. It became apparent after a period of time that the something called a SHLA, which is a Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, that part of North Dorchester was being assessed as a potential location for some development. Now, on the back of that, obviously the government have imposed some quite significant targets on local authorities, and obviously they have selected, or in the process of selecting, where they think that development might be. They are restricted. There's quite a few areas of Dorchester, Dorset, I should say, that would not be appropriate or deemed appropriate for development. Certainly, I've had a conversation with Nick Ireland and with various other planning policy consultants, specifically Hilary Jordan and Terry Sneller, who are employees of Dorset Council, and how they're trying to formulate the plan. From my perspective as a resident of Dorchester, I'm looking at that thinking, actually, I'm not sure if I want to see it at all. However, there is the point that it will be imposed upon us by government. There is something called a 5-year housing land supply. Dorset doesn't have one, in very simple terms. And there's been a recent appeal at Marnhull, which the inspector was a well-known inspector for being quite direct, and he was pretty scathing on the current situation. And the current situation is that the existing local plan basically has no weight because it is a very old plan. The new plan, which should be coming into adoption, is still quite a way away. Consequently, a lot of developers are being advised by planning barristers that this is the opportunity to make, let's say, wild applications in areas that you wouldn't normally get planning, because Dorset Council would have a difficult job defending it at appeal. Obviously, the closer the local plan becomes to adoption, the more weight that it attracts. So basically what happens is that your old local plan goes down, the new local plan comes up, and even though it hasn't been adopted, there will be a point where an inspector, who's effectively a judge, would say, we're now at a point where Dorset can demonstrate they have a plan to deliver houses. Obviously, effectively what's happened with the Labour government is they've basically said you need to double the housing land supply. Theoretically, if Dorset ignored it, the government could step in, and through a process of zoning, they could actually say, right, this area is zoned for development now. So we have effectively 6 landowners. Now, a lot of this is not in the public domain, which I'm personally surprised at, because I think that certainly my clients, which are Barbers and also Pigeon House Farm, Mrs. Kirby, very keen for this to be in the public domain and for the public to be involved in the process. So if you look at the actual land ownership, and we'll have a look at the plans a little bit further on, we have Townsend, aka Ilchester Estates, we have Bamlett, we have Mayo, which is obviously partly on the showground, etc. We have Kirby with Pigeon House Farm, we have Barber with Higher Burton Farm, and part of Higher Burton Farm is owned by the Diocese of Salisbury. And that's tenanted, which is not unusual. Interestingly, the diocese have always hidden behind the fact that they are a charity. Therefore, they have said we have a duty to get the best amount of money we can for the land. That position has changed. They have stated now publicly that they have a social responsibility to ensure that any development is sustainable. Lovely word, sustainable. Every person you ask on sustainable can't actually define what sustainable is. So I think the process there is that Bamlett and Ilchester Estates have a promotion agreement with Granger, which basically means that Granger bankroll it. Now, Granger are at a point of possibly making a speculative application. And just before Christmas, come and have a look at these in a minute, they've submitted 2 scoping plans. So a scoping plan is almost like a pre-application. And what they're saying is, what evidence do we need to support this application? And they're pretty extensive areas that they're talking about. There are 2 there, one for a small amount and one for basically 3,500 houses. There is no application as yet. The application fee will be quite substantial. I would imagine that Grangers have spent in excess of £5 million to date. So that's one of the reasons why, you know, they're so keen to push it through. They are being quite aggressive. At the previous meeting where Terry Sneller was present, they stated they intended to make an application before this Christmas. Terry Sneller, on behalf of the council, planning policy, said we don't want to see that application. We think one of the reasons why they wish to make that application is that the agreement that they may have with the landowners as a promotion agreement requires an application to be made within a certain timescale. Terry Sneller told me that that's what he thought was driving their application or potential application. It is not a holistic application. In other words, it only shows development on the land that they own or control. So if we go back to the actual agreements which are in place, we've got Bamlett and Ilchester with Granger, which is a promotion agreement, and Mayo with Wyatt Homes. Now that has changed. Approximately a year ago, they had an option agreement with Persimmon. Persimmon rather foolishly missed the renewal date, at which point Mr. Wyatt received a phone call on holiday somewhere exotic, no doubt, and within 24 hours, they'd basically done the deal with Mayo, which I've got to say, I think is a big step forward from Persimmon. Obviously, we can see locally what they've done at Charminster Farm. They definitely like to liaise with the local communities to understand what's needed, what type of housing is needed, etc. They are a business, they're there to make money, but I do think that their general approach is a much preferable approach than we would see from Persimmon. I've dealt with Persimmon elsewhere, specifically in Chickerell, and this is what we're doing, and this is how we're going to do it. And I think in Chickerell, they've actually paid to have their own planning officer allocated, which is a type of planning agreement where you want to fast track something. You can literally pay the council possibly 6 figures to get your own planning officer actually allocated for it. So that's a little bit of background to it. I said about the diocese, they have a slightly different view. The agreement we have with them, they're piggybacking on the back of us. So they don't want to spend any money. However, they're happy to go ahead on that basis. And they're also very happy to see potentially a lower density, more open spaces, lower land values, etc. And that's going back to their basically restating their social conscience of being part of, let's say, a land development which delivers more sustainable properties, better places to live, etc. So there's a little sort of history of where we are now. The various things have happened, like there's been a design group appraisal. Again, that was paid for by Granger and Wyatt Homes, and a very sensible group of experts had a look at the area and put together a plan. I'm not sure if that's actually been released into the public domain as yet. I've seen it, but sometimes Dorset are very good at hiding things on their website. It's a very large and complicated website, and in all honesty, quite often I'll actually send Terry Sneller an email and say, can you send me a link? Because I've got, thousands of pages going right the way through. So one of the premises of the whole situation was garden community. And there's certain tenant, if you like, for that type of development. And one of those is about density, one of those is about parkland, planting of trees, etc. Lots of amenity space, but also promoting actually alternative transport, like walking, like cycling. So all those things, I think we all agree, are actually good lifestyle choices. We have a little bit of a problem with when we're looking at the plans as specifically relating to the northeast corner, which is basically projecting over 4 kilometers from the center of Dorchester. Now, one of the things that we've produced, and you'll be able to see it on the plan here, is a very simple 2.5 kilometer radius from what we perceive to be the center of Dorchester, which we think is a walkable distance in terms of or cycling distance or e-bike distance or whatever method, but reducing the number of car journeys and so on. So at the moment, what we're seeing is basically just blobs of color on a plan. We've seen some suggestions from the design group, and we've seen some background from Grangers of what they intend to, which is basically on the North Dorchester consortium site. To me, what we're missing at the moment is the most pivotal piece of information, which is where is the road going and what is the road going to be? And there's a lot of talk about creating it effectively as a type of Marlborough High Street with access into shops and different areas. Harsh reality is, if there's a problem on the bypass or Monkey's Jump or Kingston Morwood Roundabout, that is going to become some form of shortcut, no matter what you do in terms of weight limits, size of vehicles, speed humps, etc. It is a harsh reality. That's the type of thing that can happen. So one of the things that have been talked about was the possibility of upgrading Cocos-Froome Lane. There may be some confusion because every now and again it's referred to as Slyers Lane. Slyers Lane is the north-south road which runs up to Piddlehinton. Cocos-Froome Lane basically runs from west to east towards Kingston Morwood. So from that perspective, that does exist. Now, it's interesting to see what's happening in Bridport at the moment, because you may well have noticed that the development there, they're now wanting to reschedule when they construct the access road and the roundabout. So you can see what tends to happen with developments. We can see it in Brewery Square. If we look at the original application with 2 hotels and maybe an arts centre and so on, some of it is just kind of there to make it look good, whereas the harsh reality in 10 years' time, well, it's not economical, therefore we're going to need more flats or whatever. So one of the things that we've been looking at and wanted to try and get into the design code, which is being reviewed at the moment, by the way. And there's a very good coordinator who's actually heading that up, who headed up the design group, who's talking a lot of sense about the design code. So the design code would go alongside the planning permission and would basically be, there's your template of what type of housing, what density we want to see, etc. But what we're not seeing at the moment is what we believe is some really key issues for sustainability, growth for Dorchester, economic growth for Dorchester. And that might be very simple things like what options will local people get? Because if it is a similar style to Poundbury, I think we'd all agree that there are very few young local people would be able to afford to buy something in Poundbury. Now, we talk about shared ownership. I mean, what's quite interesting about that is, as a practice, we do quite a lot of work for people wishing to come out of shared ownership because they've actually found it hasn't worked for them. So maybe that's not the ticket to get us away from problems associated with first-time buyers. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Charminster, there was a scheme some while ago where local people got a discount on the housing, but that was for a fixed period only. And after the fixed period elapsed, it went back to full price. So all of those houses which were, and it wasn't a great number, I think it was probably less than a dozen, were demarcated and given, if you like, a priority for local people, actually disappeared again. So the people who bought them initially had a bit of a windfall, rather like people who bought their council houses and so on. So we're saying, if you're going to make this the best it can be, then surely that should be in perpetuity. That if you do buy into that, whether it's at 70% or 75%, whether you're a key worker, and obviously we have a lot of key workers here in Dorchester, an expanding hospital, some people are commuting 70 miles to actually, because they can't afford to buy in Dorchester. So if we're looking at that as a possibility, then surely that should be at a very early stage that we're expressing that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to try and change your mind, because all of us think we don't necessarily want this. But what's interesting is if you do a planning appeal, and sorry being a bit technical here, the local authority will put together a case and they'll put it to the inspector, who's basically the adjudicator, if you like, and they will say, we want you to refuse this. However, if you decide to approve it, we want the following conditions. So I'm not saying that you should suddenly be supporting it, but what I am suggesting is that you may, let's say, consider your position to be, if we are going to have it, and it is going to be imposed on us, to make sure you have the opportunity to actually influence that and to put your points of view forward. One thing that I'm sad about, and no disrespect to all of you, is the lack of interest and, if you like, people participating of younger people. Because that was the point I made to Terry Sneller recently. I said, where are the youngsters from Hardy's or from middle schools or whatever? Because with all respect, it's not going to be us who are going to be buying or living in those properties, or hopefully thinking, is this going to be our opportunity to get onto a property ladder? And a structured ladder as well. You're looking at 2-bedroom, 3 bedrooms, etc. Not the sort of elite properties that we have seen that have been developed in other areas around us. Unfortunately, that is kind of what a developer is going to go for, because they're looking for the maximum profit. But if you're able to structure a design code which enables them to build in that way with a nice mixture of housing that basically is going to benefit the community. So the other horrible questions come up. See what's happening in Chickwell at the moment. In their planning consent, they will build a doctor's surgery. When? So they're absolutely inundated. As far as I understand it now, some of the people locally who'd always come into Chickwell and Weymouth for their doctor's appointments are now coming to Poundbury because they literally cannot cope. And there's nothing in the consent to say you must build that in year 2 or year 3. Consequently, when is it going to be built? Well, maybe year 10. So all I'm trying to say is, as a community, this is an opportunity to actually potentially influence something over which we may not have much control of whether it happens or not. I think you made a very excellent point at one of the meetings, which, on the basis of, we're all saying, no, are you going to listen to us or not? And I go back to what I was saying about the potential for central government to impose that on Dorset Council. In other words, if they don't put a plan together, they don't submit it. Interesting enough, West Dorset's previous plan, when they submitted it, I'm going back a few years now, the inspector said basically it hasn't enough housing in it. Either take it away or leave it in and I'll basically throw it back at you, or take the housing section out, look at it again and then put it back in. So that's the power that an inspector has. And then you've got something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which comes over the top. It's an umbrella which comes over the top of effectively all types of development. And it's a guidance from the government to local authorities. Well, the moment you haven't got a 5-year housing land supply, you basically revert to national planning policy framework. And that's the danger for us, is these type of rogue applications. Because normally a developer would be working quite closely with the local communities, working quite closely with the planners. Here, Bidwells, who are the planning consultants for Granger's stroke Wyatt, are very bullish. I think it's being driven by the lack of the 5-year housing land supply, but we still have the opportunity to put forward to the council that we want to see a more holistic approach. So every day that goes by, that we come closer to the point where a local plan would be adopted, it gathers more weight. But we're quite a way away from it, which is why we think Bidwell stroke Grangers are doing that. I don't think I'm talking out of turn to say that Wyatt's, in their loose agreement with Granger, are not very keen on that. That's not their approach. That's not their modus operandi, if you like. But they've basically inherited a kind of loose agreement that Persimmon had. And as I said, they would probably feel that's not the approach that they would normally take. We've been having discussions with Wyatt to see whether we can come to some kind of commercial arrangement which would still retain an element of control, rather like the duchy. So you don't just get given a piece of land by the duchy. The duchy say, yes, you can do that, but you need to build it to these standards with these types, etc. So it's more of a partnering agreement, which actually is quite beneficial because it means that smaller developers can do that. Because if you've got, suddenly you've got to find 80, 90, 100 million pounds before you see any money coming in, well, you're left with the big five, let's say, and the smaller, medium-sized developers can't do it. Whereas one of the things that has worked at Poundbury is likes of Fry's, Zero C, possibly not as much now, but Wyatt's are now working on Nansledden with the duchy as well. It's quite a good way because it helps them with financing, but it retains that element of control. What you don't want, in my opinion, is a greenfield site with a carte blanche for a developer just to do what they want. One of the worst examples of development I've seen is in Sherborne. So, and literally what happened there was Sherborne Estates, this is hearsay, so I apologise if I'm not quite correct. Sherborne Estates entered into an agreement with a developer. They thought they had an element of control. Persimmon bought the developer. At that point, they buy the legal agreement that they've got, and they just basically produced what they wanted, which is unbelievably disappointing. But actually, for us looking at it, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So from my perspective, the more involvement there is in the local community, and not necessarily to say, yes, that's what we want, but if we are going to have it, we need to make sure that we've got these components in the development, because that's going to give it longevity, a good place to live for young people bringing up family, to give economic growth to Dorchester. And I'm not seeing that in what's being put forward at the moment. I'm seeing something potentially where Grangers could decide not to build it out and to sell it. This is not Granger's market at all. Grangers are the biggest private landlord in the country, and they will build blocks of flats for university, that type of thing. So this is a departure. So Andrew Elliott, who's our planning consultant, worked for a company called Terence O'Rourke. He was Granger's planning consultant up until the point when they came into an agreement with Persimmon. And at that point, Persimmon wanted Bidwells to do it. So as Andrew had a lot of knowledge of the site, we grabbed him as part of our team because he's got an awful lot of knowledge. I think we're still a way away from Granger making an application, but I think the moment they're going to make an application, it's my opinion. I can't see anything that would change that, apart maybe from a change of government, for some, maybe Mr. Trump will come and take somebody away. But basically, you know, where we are at the moment, there's no real changes coming on the horizon. Labour government have got quite a period of time before there's going to be a general election. Obviously, the councils, again, has got quite a period of time before there's going to be local elections. So we've got quite a bit of stability there. Plus, we have one party with local council that has a majority. So again, you know, the normal fractions which might be arguing. Certainly the conversation I had with Nick Ireland, which we had on Higher Burton Farm, is he said, I don't like it, but I'm not sure that we've got any choice, quote unquote. So I'm not sure how we can prevent the government imposed targets from being reflected in the new Dorset local plan. All I'm asking is that when Granger's application comes in, which I think it'll be in a very short period of time, that we take the opportunity to actually comment upon it, that there's various issues in there which I think are not good planning. And I think the layout, the proximity to Dorchester, there's a method by which, let's say, we could create quite a nice recreation area, which would become the centre of Dorchester on the existing water meadows. The water meadows all need, there's various non-native species which have invaded that area. There's all sorts of other issues we've got to think about, which is all to do with nutrient neutrality and so on. We can do what King Charles has done and actually use the water meadows as part of that treatment solution. And that's going to give a better place for people to live. As I said, from our perspective, we're not seeing that in an application. We haven't seen anything to suggest that that's what's going to be coming. Our view will certainly be that the application, whilst it's going to tick a box for a number of houses, doesn't tick many of the boxes of what would be best for Dorchester. It's as simple as that. I've got a few plans with me to just try to make clear what the position is in terms of the land ownership. I think the...
Before we go on to the plans,
yep.
Can we just pause for questions?
Of course.
Quite a lot of information prepared.
Yep.
I'd just like to give people online a chance. If you'd like to ask any questions, please take yourself off mute. And we've got some microphones. Joe, if you could use your lapel mic so that people listening online can hear what the question is.
So, interestingly, there's various highway consultants, including we've spoken to one of the highways department who was actually part of this process up until about 5 years ago before he retired. And you know, he was quite unequivocal in sense of Kingston Ward roundabout is overloaded, Monkey's Jump roundabout is overloaded, you know, Tesco's roundabout is overloaded. So there's two approaches. From my perspective, we're looking to highway consultants because they model and they use the amount of traffic. The traffic would be developed by the new housing, etc. And it's quite an interesting thing how they do it, because we were talking about High West Street, sorry to diversify at one point, and pollution and so on. And I said, well, what percentage of electric cars have you got in there? He went, none. I said, well, where's your model? I'm not saying there's lots and lots, but it's something that's moving and changing. So I think there's two approaches. One would be an entirely northern route, which basically skirting around the northernmost perimeter of the development. Because if you do a link road through the center of the proposed new development, you've got some problems. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Duchy had no intention of putting in Middle Farm Way. That was never proposed by Leon Cryer. All the traffic was going to go through Queen Mother Square. Dorset Council, quite correctly, in my view, insisted that Middle Farm Way should exist to actually take a significant percentage of the traffic, which doesn't need to go through Queen Mother Square. I think that was absolutely the right decision. But if you look at Middle Farm Way, I think there are 3 crossing points. So if you put that through the center of a development, you're effectively cutting it in half by making, you know, or you create it in such a way that you're going to have nose-to-tail traffic all the way through, like we used to on High East Street. I've been here long enough to remember before we had the bypass. and so on. So, that question is not really being dealt with. I guess from my perspective, if you were going on the northern periphery of it, that's telling you something. Where's phase 2? So in many respects, that's down to the actual highway consultants and Dorset County Council to actually come up with a design. But we're saying, if you're going to look at this development and how it's going to form and where the northern boundary is, the first thing you're going to have to draw is the road, and what type of road is it? And that's the question which no one will answer.
And the question, who will finance?
Well,
Because
Who will finance?
Yeah.
Would central government chip in?
Well, it comes down to Highways England,
Yeah.
but basically there's a whole process. There is HIF funding, but you've got to tick so many boxes: employment, dealing with traffic, pollution, etc. I've seen developers who've declined HIF funding because they had so many conditions attached to it that it wasn't worthwhile for them to do it. And I know Wyatt did that recently on something. And Shaftesbury, which had HIF funding, that caused quite a few issues as well. So yes, if we want to see it happen, the government just writes a big check. And then the money comes back through SIL payments or a Section 106 agreement over the process of the development. But that's the problem they've got, is they're saying these housing numbers, and how do we do it? So then we go to what's happened in Bridport, where the developers got the consent and they're saying, well, we want to put back the construction of the roundabout until we've built 500 houses or whatever it is.
Yeah, because the cost of such a road will ultimately come back and hit the developer.
Correct.
And he's got to find the cost. And the only way he can do it is by increasing the sale price of what he's building or building more.
So you've got a viability test, which a developer can rely upon. So you may have a consent, which may be a Trojan horse. And that Trojan horse then is re-examined, because the viability test is the local authority's own test. If they're not producing 20% profit, it's not viable. It's as simple as that. So I have the pleasure of my youngest daughter's senior planning policy officer in London, and they're dealing with all of this all the time. Their councillors have a completely different approach, no disrespect, but they're saying, we can't get 35% affordable, but we can get 28% affordable because the numbers don't stack up. We'd rather have 28% of something than 35% of nothing. But that's a process which goes backwards and forwards. And it can be revisited multiple occasions, certainly because housing costs might not follow inflation, building costs might be in excess of inflation. How do we bring all of those things together? So, being a developer and looking at all those things is quite precarious. Equally, if it goes right, it goes very right, and they do very well out of it. So it's an interesting conundrum. But you go back to your road, I think we'll end up with a Marlborough High Street type road running roughly from the Sun Inn to a point between Kingston Moor roundabout and the lay-by, or the Gingerbread Man. That's roughly where we'll see the road. And one of the points about that is the topography, the amount of cut and fill they've got to do, the slopes, etc. And position of some woods in there which are quite old, and some other areas that need some sensitive looking at as well. So all of those things will influence it. I think it's highly unlikely we'll see a joining up of the bypass. It will be something that comes off the existing road out towards Charminster.
But on the western side, it would go through the floodplain. So it would have to be on a viaduct.
I think that's exactly what you'd be talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the same problem with, it's interesting because one of Bidwell's earliest plans showed 3 north-south connections into the southern boundary of the development. Well, where's that third one going? I mean, there's nothing there. It's, you know, it's completely spurious. I don't know whoever drew that. Obviously never been to Dorchester in their life, because where would you bring that in? We've got Blue Bridge, obviously, and we've got, you know, under London Bridge, effectively. You're going to have to create some kind of raised walkways or whatever. So I don't think that's really been thought out. There's not really the depth of knowledge and understanding. One gentleman on the planning consultancy for Grangers stated, "I know Dorchester better than anybody else." And I said, don't say that in front of the people of Dorchester. You're going to take your money and disappear off to Cambridge and look on your next project. We're going to be living here. So that's why we should be absolutely part of this. Granger were furious with us for talking to Stand. Why are you talking to them? I said, because they're local people, they're part of the community, they have an opinion. We should respect that opinion and try to listen and work with people. That is what a local community is all about. Their attitude is, well, we've got everything we need, we don't need anyone else, quote unquote.
We've got a question online from Mark. Mark, can you hear us?
Oh, hi there. Good evening. Thank you. I just would like to ask the following, really. I think the whole development, I think this proposal is disastrous. I really do. But I just want to know 2 things, really. And the first thing is, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Lovely. And the first thing is, how has the heritage of Dorchester been taken into consideration with this proposal? And the second thing I'd like to pick up on is really about the youth of the town as well, and how, like you said earlier, Stuart, about the lack of engagement really from the youth of Dorchester with regards to this development, which will be in their lifetime. Thank you.
I think that's an extremely valid point. Initially, there were some comments about the impact on Dorchester of any development south of Cocos Froome Lane. I don't really think that has been investigated fully, because actually the development can fit very easily with a relatively low density north of Cocos Froome Lane, but within a 2.5 kilometre radius of the centre of Dorchester. So the interaction, because it's not an urban extension like Poundbury it is, it's designed to be part of Dorchester and to create something where the water meadows could effectively become rather like a London Park, for example, you know, rather than, you know, how can we encroach as much as we can on it to the absolute minimum, make that's good town planning, to have, you know, an amenity immediately accessible to the vast majority of the people of existing Dorchester and the proposed Dorchester. But again, I don't believe that that's really been fully investigated. We've only had some initial comments from that, but I think that's part of the process. So I mentioned just before that there have been 2 scoping plans submitted by Bidwells on behalf of Granger, effectively saying, what do you want us to provide? So in other words, it could be evidence about crested newts, it could be evidence about water table, effect on water supply for Dorchester, sustainability of what's being built. There's a lot of different elements that need to be looked at, but I haven't seen any documentation. So a lot of the evidence that was gathered previously is about 4 or 5 years old. So all of that is going to have to be re-updated. So I think we're going to see an application without much of that evidence and with the other evidence to follow, because they'll want to comply with submitting an application within the time frame of their legal agreement with the landowners. So once they make that application, that deadline disappears. Terry Sneller, when I asked him specifically, why aren't we getting more interaction with young people, said that they had carried out trying to make connection with Hardy's, but there was a lack of interest. I said, well, how have you put that forward? Is it something which is going to be an extracurricular activity, i.e. somebody doing it after school, or is it somebody who's going to come into the school and actually use part of their curriculum time? Because a lot of youngsters wouldn't necessarily want to give up some of their spare time to understand something that doesn't necessarily affect them. So I think there should be a lot more time and effort put into that, and to encourage them to actually be part of that process, because they potentially would be the people who would live there and would benefit from that type of economic growth as well. Because obviously any development immediately brings an element of jobs, whether they just be service jobs or whatever. As I said before, I'm aware of people commuting quite a significant distance to the hospital because they can't afford to buy here, which is counterproductive, isn't it? It's not really fitting in with a green policy in any shape or form.
Have you got any more questions?
Thank you. Regardless of the detail of it, because I think, like you say, most people aren't very keen on the principle of it. But if we go along with what you're suggesting of trying to make the best out of what we've got, is there any potential to create more learning and job opportunities from the development, which will no doubt take a considerable amount of time, from the planning right through to the construction, and particularly in the field of construction, surveying, architecture, we don't have anything like that here. And, you know, I could see that there would be a potential for that.
You're absolutely correct. So one of the reasons why we were having a direct discussion with Nick Island was because barbers have a problem. Barbers produce cheese, they export it all over the world, in particular to America and Europe. They are busing people from Poole to Lytton Cheney for them to actually operate their work. They are currently sending some of their processing, obviously some of the cheese has then got to be packaged and so on before it's exported. They're actually sending that to be processed in the northeast. They would rather be doing that here in Dorchester, and one of the discussions we were having was creating a processing unit employing approximately 100 to 110 people. And that's why we were talking to Nick Island. We're going, how can we facilitate that? But we need to know where the road is, what it is, because the position of that then becomes quite important in view of connections, because you've got refrigerated HGVs coming in. You wouldn't want that parked next to you at 4 o'clock in the morning, rather like a dairy farm. Where's the holistic thinking of how we do it? The other interesting discussion we had, which was again with Terry Sneller, was about employment. A lot of people are employed on Poundbury, but you've got the chocolate factory, which employed quite a few people. We've got a couple of other Dorset cereals, which has now been relocated to Poole. So actually, their plan has been reasonably successful. But what was interesting was that Terry was saying, well, you know, we could have either a business park or maybe we could do it. And I said, well, why can't we have both? And he goes, and no reason why not. And I said, well, if you've got larger employers, they're going to want something that they can go onto, and they could potentially expand as well if they suddenly, because that's what's happened with, if you look at the chocolate factory, that's half, the original factory was half the size that it is now. But they were actually savvy enough to say, well, let's give you that site, and if it's successful, then you can extend it. Well, school was the same. What happens with school? So there's 3 schools proposed on the actual, what the design group have come up with. But when are they going to be built? We go back to this Chickerell situation where they're waiting for it virtually to be finished before they build a doctor's surgery. You know, and that overloading everybody else with an expanding population and fewer doctors. And then where do you get the doctors from? You just tick and magically make them appear from somewhere. So I'm not being negative, but I'm just saying I completely agree with you. This is a fantastic opportunity, and there are, industries that want to be based here. You probably don't know, but up by Hardy's Cottage, there's a world-leading sound company with 5 professors who actually are directors and run it, and they produce this all over the world. They love working just outside Dorchester. They look out the window, they see the open countryside. It's absolutely where they want to be. Several of my friends are doctors and consultants. When a job becomes available in Dorchester, actually in DCH, it's very well sought after because the quality of life is high. They have the ability to increase their earnings because we have the Winterbourne Hospital here. So good schools, it's just the reality it is. So all of those things would come into the same point of view, i.e., how do we create infrastructure to actually be sustainable, to keep create an industry which then goes on to provide further employment, et cetera, rather than what we're seeing down the high street now.
Can I just be very naive, Colin, and ask you, is this going to be imposed?
So, imposition is a very interesting word. The Dorset Council have a duty to comply with the government's housing targets. That's the starting point. The housing targets are there. They're a considerable step up from what we had previously. A lot of Dorset with Heathland and so on. Obviously, it's no longer an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's now national land. I don't know why they changed the name, but they have. So a lot of those areas that you possibly in another part of the country, you'd say, well, we've got all of this. Why are you going to put it here? So we look at the basic planning process. What they start looking at is, what are the transport connections? Oh, we've got 2 stations. What have we got in the way of schools? What have we got in the way of hospitals? Notwithstanding the fact that they may be oversubscribed, etc. So you've got certain areas that wouldn't comply with that. So it starts to pare it all down. I know the Duchy were quite keen at looking at some other areas of land that they own, but that's basically been set aside. I don't think it's a case of saying, oh, it won't be considered, but this has been going on for quite a long period of time. And I think if that number's imposed on Dorset, which it currently is, there will be no choice. I don't see how they can comply with that number without North Dorchester. And don't forget, that's 35 years. 100 houses a year is 35 years. If you've got 3,500 number to produce, that's 35 developments the size of North Dorchester. That's the frightening bit.
What about the crossways?
Well, I think it's slightly confusing what the council came out with, in that they put, so the SHLA, which I talked about before, you can put forward your land. They put everything in that document and basically scared the bejesus out of half the population. But all they're saying is these are pieces of land that potentially might be available. Crossways is already being developed. It's got a railway station, it's got schools, it's got a shop, it's got a public house. So again, tick, 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 tick. I live in Puddletown. We've got an application in from Wyatt at the moment, which I'll be surprised if they don't get. We'll probably see more applications coming in. Why? Because we've got 2 schools, we've got bus service, we've got a pub, we've got a doctor's surgery, etc. Would that happen in some of the other villages? No, it won't. So I think the point I'm making there is North Dorchester is only going to supply 1/35 of, because it's only 100 houses a year. That's what Poundbury's been built out, 100 houses a year. The target is 3,500. So you need that many to actually get there. I don't know how they're going to do it.
I'm going to pause the questions now if I can. If you could just, we'll still continue online.
Yep.
With the meeting. If you can explain what maybe some of these charts are and the different colours, and hopefully you can.
Yeah. So there's 2 lots here. So basically, there's 3 plans. This one is coloured with the ownership of each landowner, and it also shows what relationship they are in. In other words, do they have an option agreement? Do they have some kind of development agreement? and also shows the boundary of the red line for the development that's proposed, a blue line, which is the 2.5 kilometres from the centre of Dorchester. And then it also has, one of the criteria was they didn't want to see anything built above the contour line of 90 metres. So we've actually outlined that in orange. So that's another one of the criteria. But I'm very happy to answer any questions if you want to have a look. These two are very simplistic plans. These are what have been submitted. I think it was the day before close for Christmas or something of that order. And these are scoping plans. So they're not a planning application. It is Bidwell's asking, what information do you need when we submit these applications? In other words, evidence. So biodiversity uplift, the effect on the water table, etc., etc. So what reports do we need? So quite often, if you're making a planning application on your own property, you might need a tree surgeon's report because you're close to a tree. So hedgerows, byways, bridleways, footpaths, any other important features that would have to be maintained. So none of that information is on there, but this is what they've submitted, which is basically a precursor to what they're going to submit. And the boundary is very specifically Ilchester Estates, Mayo, Bamlett, Ilchester Estates. So the land that is owned by the Diocese of Salisbury, Pigeon House Farm, and Higher Burton Farm is specifically excluded, which is why we're saying this is not holistic. We are very happy to work together as a coalition with the other landowners to get the best that we possibly can. We are being told we can build all houses on our land, therefore we don't need you. But it's not a holistic approach. It's not the best for Dorchester. It's not good planning. That's our opinion.